An economic war between the world's closest allies, a high-stakes gamble that went catastrophically wrong, and a political lesson etched into the balance sheets of two nations. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is the story of the great North American trade war of 2025. It was a conflict ignited by one man's ultimatum and defined by the unexpected ferocity of the response. It all began with a threat, a digital proclamation that shook the foundations of a century-old partnership. When Donald Trump returned to the White House, he brought the one tool he believed could bend any nation to his will, the tariff. He aimed it squarely at America's largest trading partner, its northern neighbor, Canada. He expected a swift, quiet surrender. What he got was a lesson in modern economic warfare. This is the anatomy of a backfire. It's a story of how a plan to bring a nation to its knees instead galvanized it, and how a strategy designed to demonstrate American strength instead exposed its own vulnerabilities. The numbers tell a story of economic carnage, but beneath the data lies a more profound narrative. The moment Canada decided it would no longer be a passive recipient of American economic pressure, it decided to hit back, and as the dust settled, it became clear it had hit back much, much harder. When Donald Trump unveiled a shocking 35% tariff ultimatum, he expected Canada to fold. Pause. Instead, Canada unleashed a devastating counterpunch, triggering an all-out economic war that sent shockwaves across the United States. This is the story of how a single threat not only backfired, but ended up proving Canada's entire economic policy pivot was not just necessary, but profoundly correct. To understand the explosion, you have to understand the fuse. The year 2025 began with a seismic shift in Washington. Donald Trump's second presidency was inaugurated on January 20th, and with it came the immediate revival of his America First trade doctrine. The core belief was simple. The United States was being taken advantage of, and the only language its trading partners understood was economic force. At the top of his list, surprisingly to some, was not China, but Canada and Mexico, partners in what Trump had once called the worst trade deal ever made. The stage was set. The administration's stated goal was to rebalance what it saw as an unfair relationship. The chosen weapon was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a powerful law allowing a president to regulate international commerce in response to a national emergency. The emergency, as defined by the White House, wasn't a trade imbalance, but something far more visceral, the flow of illicit fentanyl across the borders. On February 1, 2025, the first shot was fired. President Trump signed an executive order announcing sweeping new tariffs, a 25% tariff on nearly all Canadian goods, and a slightly lower 10% on energy products, set to take effect on March 4th. The justification was a direct accusation that Canada was failing to stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States. The White House fact sheet was blunt, citing Canada's continued failure to arrest traffickers, seize illicit drugs, or coordinate with U.S. law enforcement. This was a stunning move. Using a national security law meant for rogue states against your closest ally was a dramatic escalation. To many observers, the logic seemed completely detached from reality. U.S. Customs and Border Protection data showed that less than 1% of intercepted fentanyl came from Canada. The RCMP, Canada's national police force, stated there was limited to no evidence to support the claim, but the facts on the ground seemed secondary to the political narrative. The fentanyl crisis was real and devastating in the United States, and linking it to trade provided a powerful, emotive justification for action. It was classic Trump doctrine: identify a villain, create a crisis, and offer a simple, muscular solution. The expected outcome from the White House was clear: capitulation. The Canadian economy is profoundly integrated with the U.S. market, with over 75% of its exports heading south. The assumption was that faced with such a devastating economic blow, Ottawa would have no choice but to concede. A brief 30-day pause was negotiated, pushing the implementation date to March 4th, but this only delayed the inevitable. The American strategy wasn't a single shot, but a rolling barrage. On February 10th, the Trump administration announced a global 25% tariff on steel and aluminum, set to begin March 12th. For Canada, this was a double blow. The new tariffs were cumulative, meaning Canadian steel would soon face a staggering 50% tariff and aluminum a 35% tariff. The message was unambiguous. The United States was willing to inflict immense economic pain. The intricate tapestry of the North American economy, where a single car part might cross the border half a dozen times, was being torn apart. 3/4 of the trade between the two nations involves business inputs, not finished goods for consumers. A tariff on a Canadian product was therefore often a tax on an American factory. But this complexity was dismissed. The White House expected a phone call, a white flag, and a negotiation on American terms. They had fundamentally misread the room. The world watched, expecting Canada to plead for mercy. Instead, Ottawa prepared for war. The response wasn't just a reaction. It was a meticulously crafted counteroffensive, designed not just to inflict pain, but to inflict it with surgical precision. The Canadian response was immediate and defiant. On February 1st, 2025, the same day the initial U.S. tariffs were announced, then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government declared its intention to retaliate. This wasn't going to be a token gesture. Canada announced it would impose its own 25% tariffs on an initial list of American goods worth 30 billion Canadian dollars. But that was just the opening salvo. The real threat was Phase 2. If the U.S. pushed forward, Canada's retaliation would escalate to cover a staggering, say, $155 billion, about $107 billion in American imports. When the delayed U.S. tariffs took effect at 12:01 a.m. on March 4th, Canada's did too, simultaneously. Then, as the U.S. doubled down with its steel and aluminum tariffs, Canada matched the move. On March 13th, one day after the U.S. action, Canada announced a 25% reciprocal tariff on the $29.8 billion to $20 billion worth of U.S. steel, aluminum, and a carefully selected list of other goods. This is where the strategy became brilliant. The Canadian government, armed with detailed trade data, didn't just pick random products. They picked products that would maximize political pain south of the border. This is the core principle of a successful trade war. It's not just about the economic value, but about who feels the impact. Canada targeted goods emblematic of specific American states and industries with political significance to the Trump administration. Think Kentucky bourbon, Florida orange juice, and Wisconsin-made goods. Each tariff was a targeted missile aimed at a key constituency. The effect was to turn American industries against their own government's policy. Suddenly, distillers in Kentucky and orange growers in Florida were on the phone with their congressional representatives, complaining about the tariffs that were destroying their access to a crucial export market. U.S. spirits exports to Canada, for instance, utterly collapsed. For the period of March to December 2025, exports cratered to just $60 million from a total of $203 million the previous year, a devastating partial year loss that led to layoffs and paused production at iconic brands. The automotive sector, the spine of the integrated North American economy, became the central battlefield. On April 9th, Canada's response was pointed, imposing a 25% tariff on non-USMCA-compliant vehicles and the non-North American content of compliant vehicles imported from the U.S. This was a direct hit on the complex supply chains that American automakers depend on, throwing just-in-time logistics into chaos. Then came the final, shocking escalation. On August 1st, 2025, the Trump administration delivered its ultimatum. The tariffs would be raised to a blanket 35% on all Canadian goods not compliant with the USMCA trade agreement. This was the moment of truth. And Canada's response, now under the new government of Prime Minister Mark Carney, who took office in March 2025, showed its resolve had only hardened. They would not be cowed by a bigger number. What made Canada's counterpunch so harder wasn't just the dollar value, but its strategic intelligence. The U.S. approach was a sledgehammer. Canada's response was a scalpel. Furthermore, Canada masterfully leveraged the existing USMCA agreement, which Trump himself had championed. On March 6th, the U.S. was forced to clarify an exemption for goods that complied with USMCA rules. Initially, this applied to only about 40% of Canadian exports, as many businesses hadn't bothered with the paperwork for what was previously a low-tariff environment. This still blunted the sledgehammer. Canada seized on this, with Prime Minister Carney later announcing that Canada would reciprocate by dropping many of its own retaliatory tariffs on USMCA-compliant goods, while keeping the painful ones on steel, aluminum, and autos in place. It was a brilliant diplomatic maneuver that positioned Canada as the reasonable actor, the one respecting the trade deal. When you declare war on your largest trading partner, there are no winners, only degrees of loss. The economic shockwaves from the 2025 trade war were felt in factory shutdowns, lost jobs, and higher prices on both sides of the border. Let's start with the raw numbers. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce projected a devastating impact. For Canada, a full-blown trade war threatened to shrink its GDP by 2.6%, a staggering 78 billion Canadian dollars, and cost up to 510,000 jobs. But here is the critical part of the backfire. The United States was far from immune. The same analysis showed the U.S. economy would shrink by 1.6% of GDP. Because the American economy is so much larger, the absolute loss was astronomical, $467 billion US. The trade war was projected to cost the U.S. over 400,000 jobs. The aggressor was bleeding, and bleeding profusely. The pain was concentrated. The tariffs on steel and aluminum, which Trump increased from 25% to 50% on June 3, 2025, hit downstream manufacturers hard. This is the fundamental flaw in the America First tariff strategy. It presumes imports are exclusively foreign. In reality, a huge portion of what the U.S. imports from Canada are inputs for American factories. Taxing them just makes American-made products more expensive. A March 2026 poll confirmed this, with a majority of Americans believing they themselves, not foreign countries, were bearing the brunt of the costs. While both economies suffered, the political and strategic fallout was deeply asymmetrical. In Canada, the trade war fostered a powerful sense of national unity. The Carney government was seen as standing up to a bully. In the United States, the narrative was one of chaos and self-inflicted wounds. Industries were pitted against their own government. Republican-led states found themselves lobbying the White House for relief. The policy, intended to project strength, was instead creating internal political divisions. The damage even extended to personal relationships. By July 2025, polls showed 3/4 of Canadians intended to avoid travel to the U.S. Later data confirmed it. Return trips by Canadians from the U.S. were down significantly, while travel to overseas countries was up. Perhaps the most significant long-term consequence was the erosion of American credibility. By using a national security justification that was widely seen as baseless, the administration signaled it was willing to weaponize trade for any political purpose. Canada's defiant and intelligent response showed other middle powers that it was possible to push back. The ultimate irony is that the USMCA agreement, a signature achievement of Trump's first term, became Canada's most effective shield. By exempting compliant goods, the U.S. inadvertently limited the scope of its own attack and gave Canada the moral and legal high ground. The 2025 trade war was a defining moment, revealing the hidden mechanics of global power and the true cost of economic nationalism. Understanding these forces is more critical now than ever. If you want to go deeper into the geopolitical and financial strategies that shape our world, check out the resources linked in the description. These events aren't just headlines. They have real-world consequences for your finances and your future. By supporting the channel, you help make these analyses possible. And if you're getting value from this breakdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. Looking back, the story of Trump's 35% tariff ultimatum is one of profound miscalculation. The White House saw an asymmetrical relationship, saw Canada's dependence on the U.S. market, and believed that one hard push would make the whole thing collapse in their favor. What they failed to see was the intricate web of supply chains that made the pain reciprocal, the political cost of a scattergun approach, and the resolve of a nation that refused to be defined by its dependency. The ultimatum backfired because it was a blunt instrument in an era that demands precision. The cost, a projected loss of $467 billion to U.S. GDP, was not a price the American economy could pay without consequence. It fueled inflation, threatened hundreds of thousands of jobs, and turned powerful domestic industries into a political opposition force. In stark contrast, Canada's response was a masterclass in modern economic statecraft. By targeting specific, politically sensitive American goods, Ottawa maximized its leverage. The retaliation wasn't just punitive, it was communicative. Every tariff on Kentucky bourbon or Florida oranges was a direct message to a specific member of Congress. This strategic acumen, combined with a deft use of the USMCA agreement as both a shield and a diplomatic tool, allowed Canada to seize control of the narrative. The bigger picture reveals a crucial lesson about power. The 2025 trade war demonstrated the latent power of the supposedly weaker partner. It showed that in an interconnected world, economic integration isn't just a vulnerability, it's a weapon. The same supply chains that made Canada dependent on U.S. consumers also made U.S. manufacturers dependent on Canadian inputs. Canada's great achievement was recognizing this weapon could be wielded defensively. Ultimately, the 35% ultimatum failed to achieve any of its stated goals. It didn't force Canada into major concessions. It didn't solve the fentanyl crisis it was supposedly about. It didn't strengthen the American economy. It weakened it. Instead, it accomplished the opposite. It accelerated Canada's efforts to diversify its trade partnerships, a long-term strategic loss for the United States. And most ironically, it forced a surge in the importance of the USMCA as companies scrambled to comply with its rules to avoid the very tariffs his administration had imposed. The trade war of 2025 will be remembered not as a display of American might, but as the moment its closest allies showed the world that when pushed it would and could hit back harder.